This is breakout session A, and it's another session on disease management. In this session, we're going to talk about advancements in AKI and new research in acute kidney injury, which I think might be very surprising to you. We're going to hear from several panelists, and I think that you will find information during this session quite useful and perhaps a little bit surprising. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Ivonne Schulman. She is the program director for the Translational and Clinical Studies of Acute Kidney Injury with the National Institute of Health, National Institute Diabetes, Digestive, and Kidney Disease, and with the KUH Kidney, Urologic, and Hematologic Division. Dr. Schulman?
Hello, my name is Ivonne Schulman. I'm Program Director for Translational and Clinical Studies of Acute Kidney Injury at the National Institutes of Health. And today I'm going to be presenting about our new consortium called Caring for Outpatients After Acute Kidney Injury, the COPE AKI consortium, funded by the National Institutes of Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Diseases of the National Institutes of Health. So what is known about acute kidney injury? Acute kidney injury is defined as an abrupt, meaning within hours or days, decrease in kidney function, which encompasses both injury, meaning structural damage to the kidney, as well as loss of function. AKI, as we call it in abbreviation, is seen in about 10 to 15% of people admitted to the hospital and in more than 50% of people admitted to the intensive care unit. The causes of AKI are classified as either due to a decreased blood flow to the kidney from low blood pressure, for example. It could also be due to damage to the kidney itself from drugs or an infection, or it could be due to blockage of urine flow, like from a stone, a large prostate, or cancer. There are 3 stages of acute kidney injury. Stages 1, 2, and 3, and these are graded according to the increasing severity of kidney function impairment. AKI is associated with subsequent increased risk of chronic kidney disease, as well as end-stage renal disease requiring dialysis, various cardiovascular diseases, and death. The severity, duration, and frequency of episodes of AKI, as well as your age, any pre-existing chronic kidney disease and other diseases such as heart failure are associated with greater risk of kidney disease progression and death after an acute kidney injury. This is a graphical representation of what I just discussed, and it's showing that acute kidney injury and chronic kidney disease are interconnected syndromes. The risk factors for an acute kidney injury are similar to those for the development of chronic kidney disease and include age. As we age, there's a higher risk. Certain race and ethnic groups have a higher risk as well. Genetic factors, hypertension, diabetes, metabolic syndrome. Acute kidney injury of a severe degree is more likely to cause the development or progression of chronic kidney disease if you already have chronic kidney disease. The number of episodes, the duration of the injury all contribute to development or progression of chronic kidney disease after an acute kidney injury event. And the outcomes from both are similar. Cardiovascular events such as stroke, myocardial infarction, heart failure, kidney events such as worsening of your kidney function to the point of possibly developing end-stage renal disease and requiring dialysis, disability, diminished quality of life, and death. So what is unknown about AKI? There's limited evidence to inform recommendations for processes of care or therapeutic interventions targeting the progression of kidney disease and the associated morbidity and mortality in survivors of moderate to severe acute kidney injury. Can a process of care or medical intervention, such as clinical follow-up in a nephrology clinic, education, more frequent clinical care or therapies with available treatments improve outcomes in AKI survivors? What are potential designs for a study to follow up a post-hospitalization acute kidney injury patient in an outpatient setting? In whom or when might these medical interventions or processes of care be effective? What are possible primary outcomes that might respond to an intervention? And how do we adequately power a study, meaning how many patients do we need to include in the study in order to us to be able to evaluate the therapeutic intervention? The goal of the COPE-AKI consortium is to develop and test interventions that aim to reduce morbidity, meaning chronic kidney disease development, heart failure, end-stage renal disease, etc., compared with usual care in patients after hospitalization with a moderate to severe AKI. Both clinical outcomes and patient-centered outcomes will be assessed. Examples of those would be rate of rehospitalization, rate of deaths, development of chronic kidney disease or heart failure, as well as quality of life type of outcomes. Patient voices are critical throughout the protocol development process of this study and study implementation. This consortium is not intended to test novel drug therapies such as phase 1, 2, or 3 drug studies, and it's more intended to study processes of care after a hospitalization with an acute kidney injury. The second goal of the consortium is to produce a clinical protocol and thereby a study that have outcomes that are clinically important, feasible interventions, adequate number of subjects available, and adequate power to test the intervention. The COPE-AKI consortium is composed of 3 clinical centers that will work collaboratively with a scientific and data research center on the design, planning, execution, and analysis of the study. The consortium is expected to comprise a wide range of expertise, including but not limited to nephrologists, primary care physicians, intensivists, biostatisticians, ethicists, data scientists, and, very importantly, patient advisor participants. The final study protocol will be designed by the clinical centers and scientific and data research center, principal investigators, co-investigators, and patient representatives, and approved by the steering committee and then the Data Safety Monitoring Board and the NIDDK. Consortium study results are expected to provide evidence for management approaches to improve outcomes after a hospitalization with AKI. Each clinical center is expected to enroll and follow between 300 and 500 patients in the study. Each clinical center has submitted a plan for screening hospitalized AKI patients to identify patients being discharged and a proposed outpatient intervention. A clinical center may propose satellite hospital sites to work together under its direction to fulfill recruitment requirements if necessary. Administration and meetings. The steering committee will serve as the governing body of the consortium. Its actions and decisions will be determined by majority vote. It is composed of the SDRC and clinical center principal investigators, other key investigators, the NIDDK project scientists, as well as patient participant representatives. The steering committee responsibilities will include providing input on and approval of all studies developed by the consortium members prior to study implementation, as well as review and approval of all data analysis, public presentations, also the development of policies and procedures for submission and approval of research applications using the consortium resources. These meetings are being held bi-weekly by video or telephone conference calls. The executive committee is comprised of the Scientific Data and Research Center PIs and the NIDDK project scientists, additional clinical center and SDRC investigators, as well as NIDDK program officers, patient participant representatives, and other support personnel will participate in the executive committee as needed. Executive committee will make all operational decisions for the consortium, and it is meeting also by means of weekly video or telephone conference calls. The NIDDK project scientists will assist the steering committee in the development of all of the consortium study protocols and monitor the progress of the study and functioning of all the consortial activities. A data safety monitoring board called the DSMB will be appointed by the NIDDK to provide input on the design of the studies prior to the implementation. It will monitor the research efforts, the progress and safety of the study, and advise primarily the NIDDK as well as the consortium investigators. The DSMB will include biostatisticians, pharmacists, nephrologists, ethicists, and chronic kidney disease and acute kidney injury patient participant representatives. The clinical centers and scientific data and research center have each identified at least 2 patient representatives from the community that will serve in a patient advisory committee. This committee will provide feedback to the consortium regarding the design and conduct of the study, and one NIDDK and 1 SDRC member will staff this committee. Other committees in the consortium, each of which will include at least 1 patient representative, are listed here and include protocol development, recruitment, quality assurance, adjudication, and publications committees. The proposed timelines are as follows. We plan to have the clinical protocol finished by December 31st of this year, review by the NIDDK and the DSMB by March of 2022, revisions and final protocol approval by April 15th, and study start by June or July of 2022. Thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate the AAKP inviting me to give this talk and inform you on this study, which we believe will be very important for the AKI patient community. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Schuman. We appreciate your presentation and certainly that which you are doing in your role as oversight for this particular project. And now we're going to hear from Dr. Abbey, and he will be joined by Marla Levy. But first, a word on Dr. Abbey, who is Associate Professor of Medicine and Biostatistics and Clinical and Translational Science. He's Director for the Center for Clinical Trials and Data Coordination and Director for the Center for Research and Healthcare Data at the University of Pittsburgh. And he has graciously allowed myself and Paul Conway to participate in this project, and our fellow patient, who you're going to hear from, Marla Levy. A word on Marla. She's a proud survivor of 4 open heart surgeries. She has dealt with acute kidney injury and chronic kidney disease. If you Google Marla, Miracle Child, in San Francisco, you can read a little bit about her story. And I want to point out that what Marla has experienced makes it even that much more important that studies such as this take place and they get full support from the patient community. Dr. Abbey?
Hello, my name is Kalab Ababa. I'm an associate professor of medicine and biostatistics at the University of Pittsburgh. I'm also the principal investigator for the Scientific and Data Research Center for the COPE AKI consortium. I'm incredibly honored to be here at the AAKP National Meeting to speak on the importance of patient engagement in the COPE AKI consortium. By way of disclosures and funding, I have no disclosures, and as you can see on the slide, we have funding sources from the National Institute of Health, NIDDK, for the Pittsburgh SDRC, as well as the Cleveland Clinic, Johns Hopkins, and Vanderbilt UAB sites. So by way of background, and I don't think this is unknown to this audience, but AKI, acute kidney injury, is common, costly, and deadly. As an example, for every 100 patients that's seen in an intensive care unit, approximately 60 of them would have AKI. And if not addressed, AKI can lead to a number of things: cardiovascular disease, chronic kidney disease, kidney failure, end-stage renal disease, or even death. And that's just in the hospital. After discharge or post-hospitalization, there are still a number of things that can go wrong. Number one, lack of continuity of care. So the patient needs to be connected with their PCP, possibly a dietitian, maybe another specialty physician, such as a nephrologist, nurse care manager. If any of those things are not done, there's a serious lack of continuity of care in which the PCP or nephrologist may not know what the nurse care manager has worked with the patient on. There could be delays in follow-up, making sure that the patient is getting to their appointments in a timely fashion. There could be suboptimal medication management as well. So any of these things, and definitely in combination, can lead to increased risk of adverse outcomes if they're not taken care of. So there's a clear need to test process of care interventions. So not necessarily drugs or therapeutics, but process of care interventions following AKI hospitalizations. And this can be a combination of nurse navigators, telemedicine, or pharmacist-involved medication reconciliation. So the overall goals of COPE AKI are to do the following. We want to be able to develop and test process of care interventions that aim to reduce AKI disease burden in patients who have moderate to severe AKI after they have been discharged from the hospital, as well as produce a clinical trial protocol that has the following important elements. Number one, making sure that outcomes are important to not just clinicians and researchers, but to patients. Make sure that we're testing feasible interventions, the ability to enroll sufficient study participants, and enough quote unquote scientific strength, or in other words, statistical power, to answer the primary questions. In general, the organizational structure is, as you can see on the screen, a combination of clinical centers, scientific data research center that has a number of content areas in the following: kidney disease, patient-reported outcomes, medication management. And we have a strong connection with NIDDK as a collaborative partner in all of this. And I'll go through each of these sites in a bit more detail. So as mentioned before, I lead the Scientific and Data Research Center, which is based at the University of Pittsburgh. And I lead this with colleagues, Doctors Linda Freed, Sandy Kane-Gill, and Paul Pilevsky, all at the University of Pittsburgh in the Department of Medicine and Pharmacy and Therapeutics. We bring to the table expertise in a number of different areas as well as infrastructure. So we have expertise in patient-reported outcome ascertainment and development, health information technology, telehealth, namely nephrology, biostatistics and clinical trials in kidney disease, and a core lab in biobanking. And as you can see towards the bottom, we have a lot of existing centers and existing infrastructure at the University of Pittsburgh that will help the SDRC and the COPE AKI in general carry out our proposed trial. At the Cleveland Clinic, which is one of three clinical centers, this is led by Dr. Emilio Poggio, and they bring to the table a lot of additional expertise in recruitment and intervention coordination, patient engagement, as well as the analysis and interpretation of both clinical and patient-reported outcomes. At the Southeastern Acute Kidney Injury Alliance, this is a joint site between Vanderbilt University in Nashville and University of Alabama at Birmingham. This is co-led by Eddie Sue and Orlando Gutierrez, and they additionally bring to the table expertise in patient-reported outcome measurement interpretation, biostatistics, intervention, namely with respect to telemedicine, and then bioethics as well. Our last site at the Johns Hopkins University, this is led by Chirag Parikh, and they are working with the Yale and University of Maryland sites as well to bring on recruitment. But they also bring to the table health informatics expertise, as well as patient advocacy and a community advisory board. And as I mentioned before, we have a strong collaborative partnership, not just from the funding point of view, but a strong collaborative partnership with NIDDK, NIH's Kidney Institute, and we have programmatic leadership and collaboration from Dr. Yvonne Schulman and Dr. Paul Kimmel, as well as Neha Shah. And last, but definitely not least, we have a participant advisory committee, and this is led by Richard Knight, and includes a number of fantastic participants who have experienced AKI in the past, one of which you'll hear later today with Marla Levy. But this is an integral part of our consortium, which I'll explain in a few minutes. So why is patient engagement important? And there was an article several years ago in Clinical Trials by Bray Patrick Lake that really talked about this from the perspective of a nonprofit organization, Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative. And they spoke at length with respect to what was driving or prohibiting patient engagement, and then as well as feedback in terms of how to engage patients, not just the patients themselves, but also to stakeholders and funders. So the biggest driving force to preventing good patient engagement was the fact that there's no best practices. And a lot of this is really due to a severe heterogeneity in organizational structure. So patient group interest, capabilities, where they place their values, their assets, the culture, all of that is so different across different organizations that it really prohibits a standard best practice. And so they outline recommendations for patient engagement, but this was geared towards stakeholders as well as patient groups and funders as well. So I'll go through several of these now. For stakeholders, for all stakeholders, really engaging the patient voice by establishing partnerships to improve trial design and execution, a clear definition of expectations, roles, and responsibilities of all the partners, building trust, which is incredibly important for successful partnerships, and making sure that there's transparency and trustworthiness, involving the expertise of multiple partners for a broader perspective, and then managing real or perceived conflicts of interest by establishing policies that ensure this transparency and accountability. For the researchers, we need to, number one, make sure that we are integrating into this research and portfolio planning an assessment of patient group expertise, assets, and value. That has to be from the outset. We want to make sure we match expertise and assets to the specific needs of our research programs, ensure that patient groups are essential partners and are not considered or thought of as token voices, making sure that there's a consistent established guiding principles and clear lines of communication for collaboration, making sure that there's a mechanism to measure the impact of patient engagement. It's not just that you set up a patient group or set up a collaboration and let it go from there. We have to see if it's working, as well as establishing ongoing relationships with patient groups and communicate openly. And then lastly, for patient groups, proactively identifying and engaging and bringing voices to the table, making sure that patient groups are promoting their value as an essential partner, that they deliver their expertise and assets to sponsors throughout the entire process, not just at the very beginning, and selecting sponsors who have a product or a program with a significant promise for your constituents, the constituents that the patient group represents. And then, of course, as mentioned before, managing real or perceived conflicts of interest. What has gone on, or what have we done as part of the COPE AKI consortium with respect to this? So there was an article several years ago in the Journal of American Society of Nephrology, Improving Care for Patients After Hospitalization with Acute Kidney Injury, where they really summarized a working group from 2019. And this working group, which was convened by NIDDK, included a multidisciplinary group of not just scientists and clinicians, but also to patient stakeholders. And they asked a number of different questions, but among them was, what is most important to patients who have experienced AKI? And what it came down to was really focused on making sure that there was a clear way to identify and measure patient-centered outcomes, and the following specifically: symptom burden, psychological burden, health-related quality of life, and frailty. So during grant development at the University of Pittsburgh, we were very intent on making sure that we involved patient advocates who had experienced AKI into our weekly project discussions as we were developing the grant. We made sure to solicit input from a slightly larger patient panel that included both Paul Conway and Richard Knight, and who are current and former presidents of AAKP, as well as other patient advocates. And then we also worked with them in particular, and as the rest of the AAKP leadership, to conduct a survey that went out to members to really make sure that we were proposing to assess appropriate domains and making sure that none were overlooked. And for those that are AKP members, you may have remembered receiving this, but an email coming straight from AAKP asking to take this survey, which is really getting a sense of the experiences of patients with AKI. And so this cohort was a bit over 100 participants who had experienced AKI. The demographics of the cohort ranged in terms of age at the first AKI episode, ranged from experiencing as an infant all the way to 82 years of age. Majority were female. Nearly a quarter of them were ethnic or racial minorities. Nearly 90% reported that their AKI episode was either very or extremely physically or emotionally impactful. And then in terms of what patient endorsed with respect to AKI-specific effects, you can see in this graph that 40% of them worried about the effects of their AKI episode on their family or work. 20% of them were concerned about healthcare costs. An additional 20% were having the trouble getting AKI information from doctors. Nearly a quarter of them had a lack of healthcare coordination or as a perceived issue. Not having enough information about AKI was endorsed by 27% of them. Not feeling well emotionally, having trouble sleeping, another 37%. Being unable to do daily activities, feeling weak or tired, and not physically well, more than 40% for each one. And so you can see this really clusters into some of this physical or emotional burden or well-being, but also to a handful of this is related to the healthcare process. And again, goes back to what we mentioned before, lack of coordination, lack of continuity of care. And so our first pass as we were developing our proposal, our grant submission was focused on measuring primary outcomes, focused on global and AKI-specific health-related quality of life. But we also had some secondary outcomes focused on symptoms, functional and psychosocial status, knowledge, social support, interactions with providers as well. And I should mention that this is an ongoing and evolving process as we work with our patient advisors to develop and fine-tune the protocol. Now, during protocol development, what we've been working on for the past several months, in addition to our steering committee, we also have a participant advisory committee, which is comprised of the 9 members that I mentioned before, all who have experience in some form or fashion AKI. So we've involved PAC members in protocol writing committees. We have 7 of them currently to help draft our clinical trial protocol, and they are providing critical feedback over the course of our bi-monthly meetings, in which we engage with them and work to push forward on coming to consensus on protocol development. In addition to this, they will and have already been playing a critical role in a number of other things. Number one, this PAC committee will really help with drafting, putting their best foot forward in drafting the COPE-AKI informed consent document, as well as helping really shape the process for returning of study results to study participants at the end of the study. So I want to lead with a couple take-home points. Number one, COPE-AKI, the consortium as a whole, and obviously even before us with NIDDK leading the charge, purposely and intentionally sought to include patients and their unique insights into this initiative before the grant was even written. And while for some people it may seem like quantitative data is the backbone of clinical research, people need to make sure they don't forget that patient insight and stories have an immeasurable impact on researchers and clinicians. And researchers and clinicians need to make sure they are listening and hearing this. So on behalf of the entire COPE-AKI consortium, I want to make sure that people know that we are committed to ensuring that the patient voice is heard, not just at the beginning, but over the entire course of the consortium and beyond. So I want to take the time yet again to thank everyone for listening, thank everyone at the AAKP National Meeting. I'm really excited to turn this over to Marla Levy, who is, as I mentioned, one of our participant advisory committee members, who will talk about the importance of patient engagement, but from the participant or patient perspective. Thank you.
Hi, I want to thank the AAKP for allowing me the opportunity to share some of my incredible story of survival, and this will definitely give you more of a perspective on how important it is to include patients in the engaging and their perspectives with the consortium. I was born with a congenital heart defect. It's called supravalvular aortic stenosis, and that is a narrowing of the aortic valve. I lived with it until I was 21 when I was diagnosed, and at 27, they replaced it with a human valve. I had several years with the human valve to have children, and that window allowed me to have 2 babies. So now fast forward, I'm 41 years old, I have a 1 and 2-year-old, and I have to get my homograph aortic valve replaced because it was failing. I knew that day was coming, and I was just grateful that it lasted long enough to have children. So I go into surgery, and when I wake up, my surgeon says to me, "I have good news and bad news." And I thought, this is not who I want to hear this from. He said, "The good news is it was a successful case." So I thought in my head, well, this can't be, what could be worse? He said, "The bad news is you have such extensive arterial sclerosis, we have to go back in and do another surgery." And I said to him, "Well, why wouldn't you have just done the surgery while you were in there?" And he said, "I'm a pediatric cardiothoracic surgeon, and you need an adult cardiothoracic team. That's their wheelhouse. They specialize in bypasses." So in a 10-day period of time, I was worked up for a completely different type of heart surgery. And they took me in 10 days later, and I had a triple bypass. Unfortunately, after the case, my heart did not start. They couldn't get me off the pump. And they tried for hours upon hours, 6 to be exact. I don't know if there's anyone else in the world, any other team in the world that would have spent that much time on a patient in hopes to bring them back. They decided at about 5.5, 6 hours that the only option for me to survive would to be put on a machine called ECMO, which is a bypass machine for your heart and lungs. It's the most, I was in critical condition, and it's the most aggressive form of life support you could be on. So their plan was to keep me in the ICU for 2 days and take me back to the operating room to see if they can get my heart started. Well, they did that with no success. So they take me back to the ICU, and by this time my kidneys are failing, and they have me on CRRT for 24 hours a day, on top of the fact I don't have a heart or kidney. So I'm in triple organ failure, 2 collapsed lungs. I was internally hemorrhaging with a mystery infection. So I was in dire shape, and a lot of the clinicians told me after the fact, no one thought I would be able to survive this. So day 4 goes by, they take me back to the operating room, and my heart did not start again. At this point, my GFR was 0, my creatinine was off the charts, and that was just one of the many things that they were worried about. Day 6, they basically said to my husband, "If we can't get her heart to start today, we're going to have to try other measures, and that would be a heart transplant." So he was very, very nervous. They would have to give me something called an LVAD, which is a bridge until you can get a heart donated. So by the grace of God, on day 6, my heart started. My ejection fraction was barely 10. My heart was barely working. But up until that point, they had no hope for me. And now they had a heartbeat. A heartbeat. That's more than they had for the last 6 days. So they slowly titrated me off of ECMO, and I started my recovery. It was their hope, because I was 41 and healthy, that my AKI situation would eventually take care of itself, and my kidneys would, they called it wake up. And they basically said, "Listen, you have about 90 days for your kidneys to wake up. After that, the chances of them ever fully recovering is slim to none. So we really, really are up against the timeline here, your clock." So after 7 weeks in the hospital, I was discharged. And this is where the story is very important for you guys. They discharged me and got me into an outpatient dialysis center near my house. I went for the first 2 treatments on a Monday and a Wednesday. And I happened to have a scheduled cardiology appointment on that Friday. I was very, very ill. I actually had to go to the operating room on Thursday because my blood pressure was over 220. And when my cardiologist looked at me, he had tears in his eyes, and he looked at my husband and said, "How fast can you get her to the hospital?" He said, "I don't have time to call 911. Get her in the car now." So they rushed me to the hospital, treated me for fluid. It had UCSF. It was the most severe case of fluid overload they had ever seen. And of course, with that came congestive heart failure and a slew of other issues it was causing. So they nursed me back to life. It took about 6 hours of removing fluid from me to get me back to where I should have been in the first place. And they discharged me 4 days later. So the following week, I'm back at the outpatient dialysis center, and I get 2 more treatments. Same exact thing is happening. I happen to have a follow-up appointment with my cardiac surgeon that Friday, and he took one look at me in a wheelchair. At this point, I had such severe fluid overload. My husband had me in a wheelchair, wrapped in blankets. My eyes were everything was so swollen on me, I couldn't open my eyes. And he took one look at me, and they immediately admitted me to the hospital. And again, they took over 6 hours to remove enough fluid to get me to where I needed to be. My congestive heart failure was getting even worse. And at that time, I was told, now that this has happened twice in the first 2 weeks out of surgery, the chances of your kidneys ever truly healing is significantly decreased, which is so disappointing because I was doing everything on my part to stay positive and hopeful. Yet, because of the issues I was having with dialysis, it was causing these terrible issues. So now I'm absolutely traumatized. I had spent the last 2 weekends for 4 days in the hospital, and I was scared to death that if they discharged me and took me back to that dialysis center, I would die. I actually knew I would. And guess what they did? They sent me back. At this point, I still don't have a nephrologist. When I checked out of the hospital, they let me go, and I didn't have anybody's phone number. Not one person followed up with me nephrology-wise. I didn't even understand what was wrong with me or what the prognosis was. And it was so confusing and scary to be on my own island, knowing I'm so close to death and I have nobody that can help me. They sent me back to the dialysis center for the 3rd time. And the night before I went, my husband and I had a heart-to-heart. And I said to him, I think I'm going to die. I really think I'm going to die. I don't think there's any chance I'm going to survive this next treatment. And I said, I feel so desperate because I have no one to call. I don't have a doctor. I don't know who to call. And here I am, I'm about to die, and I have a 1 and 2-year-old. We were in tears trying to figure out what to do. We felt so hopeless at the fact that I was completely abandoned. And I basically went in knowing that I would be dying that day. I had kissed my babies goodbye, and I went in. And again, I'll use this term a lot, by the grace of God, they gave me a different technician. And I guess that first technician was doing everything wrong. What had happened is my medical records were never sent to the outpatient dialysis center. I had just had 3 open heart surgeries. I had been on ECMO for 6 days. And I was in triple organ failure with 24-hour dialysis. And here I show up to the outpatient surgery center with no medical records. I was horrified to find out they got nothing. And I said, didn't you request anything? They said, yeah, we did, but they never sent any. And I said, well, wouldn't you call them back to find out? I said, I just got out of 7 weeks in the hospital. I'm still not breathing. I can't stand up. I'm not your average patient. I need to be treated differently. And they very much discarded and looked down on my opinions. They thought I was just making a big deal out of nothing, when I was truly understanding the situation I did. What dialysis center had any investment in me as a human being. In fact, the doctor would skip over me and not even speak to me. So I didn't even have a doctor I can ask questions to. All I had was my dialysis technician, who, to be perfectly honest, I didn't trust because of what had happened in the past. That night, I had the conversation with my husband about what can we do? Who do I call? I can't just call the hospital and say, hi, I was in the hospital. I'm on dialysis. I think I'm going to die. They've put me in the hospital twice, and I don't think I could take it anymore. There's nothing more hopeless you could ever imagine in your life but to be in my shoes at that point. And I guarantee you full-heartedly that I am not an isolated incident. I can tell you with full conviction that I think I'm more of the norm than the exception to the rule. And unfortunately, I'd imagine the majority of patients who were in my position did not survive. I survived, and nobody can figure out how. And everybody till this day, when they see me, my clinicians say, Marla, you're here for a reason. And I always look at them and say, you know what my reason is. I survived to be able to sit here today and share my story and show you a day in the life of what happens when patients leave the hospital. It's crucial that there's some sort of follow-up. It's crucial that a patient has a nurse navigator. Anybody follow up. Are you okay? Are you doing well? Someone to explain, what do all the test results mean that they're taking? Someone who lets you know there is a chance you can survive this. Not one time through this entire journey was I told you will survive. So I went through it thinking this is my demise. And interestingly enough, I had the intrinsic hope. I had something inside of me that thought, I can do this. And maybe I was naive, and maybe I didn't understand the complexity of my situation. But I held on to hope, and I wouldn't let anyone steal it. And to this day, every single doctor at UCSF, every nurse, said the only variable that set me apart from anybody else in my position was that I was so positive, and I just kept my head up no matter how horrible things were getting. So with that in mind, just to finish my story, after a few months, I was able to get off of dialysis. For 90 days, I had no nephrologist. And at 90 days, my dialysis center sent me back to UCSF and said, your kidneys aren't getting any better. You need to go get permanent access. The only reason I went back is because they sent me. So I met with them, and the surgeon said, I don't feel like you're a good candidate for PD. He said, I'd like to get the opinion of our chief nephrologist. And that gentleman took a look at my records, and he looked up at me after 45 minutes and said to me, I'm going to take you off dialysis. And I couldn't believe my ears. It didn't make sense. Here I am clinging to life on dialysis, and he wants to pull my lifeline. I said to him, what are you thinking? And he said to me, I don't think you should be on dialysis. I think it's hindering your recovery. Let's allow your kidneys the opportunity to work on their own. And I said, I'll try anything at this point. So they put me in the hospital, And over the period of 8 days, they took my blood every 6 hours, and I was able to tolerate being off of dialysis. They sent me home, and after about 3 weeks, I got my dialysis catheter taken out. And besides getting married and having children, it was the happiest day of my life. There's no way I could describe the feeling of them saying, here's your quality of life back. Here you go. You could be a human being again. You could join society. You can make plans with your kids to watch them. And you know that there's a chance you can survive all this. So with all of this in mind, why I think it's crucial that the COPE AKI consortium includes patient perspective is because stories like mine, you can't read in books. You can't find online. There's no studies about Marla Levy's experience in the hospital. They only are working off of what they have experienced in their past with other patients and what they've learned in books and online and through other doctors. They don't understand the scope of what really goes on. And if I can just give one pearl of wisdom from everything I've been through, it would be treat the human being, not the organ. I'm going to say that again. Treat the human, not the organ. I don't think without patient engagement and patient perspective, anyone would ever come to this conclusion. What I explained to my doctors was my mental health was so poor that no matter what they did with my kidneys, if I had no hope, I wasn't going to get better. And they weren't treating me as the whole person. They were just focusing on my kidneys. I feel it's imperative that mental health is included with the recovery of patients that have AKI, because I'm sure a lot of people, unfortunately, didn't have my will to live or my positive attitude and didn't make it. So I just want to thank the AAKP for allowing me the opportunity to share my story. I feel so grateful to be here today and to be able to hopefully give you some food for thought as to how important it is to hear the story from the person who lays behind the rails. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Marla. Marla, I've heard your story before, and I'm honored to hear it again. And I want to tell you, I want to give you a heartfelt thanks for sharing what you have been through with the listening audience. And I think that it really highlights the reason why we do the research that we're doing. Many of you may not know, if you Google Miracle Child, there will be an article that will come up on Marla, because it is a true blessing that she is here with us today, and she so readily shares her experience. If you're like me, it's just hard to imagine someone going through that. You talk about a positive mental attitude. Marla can be the poster child for that. And I'm certainly honored to participate with her on this, as a patient participant on this project, as well as several other projects. I also want to thank Dr. Abbey and Dr. Schuman for sharing your insights about AKI and really the importance of it, because I believe many patients hear about it due to what's going on with the COVID-19, but the insights that you have provided, I think, will be very valuable to us having a better understanding as to the impact AKI can have on our lives. Again, thank you to this panel, and I wish you a great day.